Well, welcome to Headlines and Headaches. I'm Mike, and the guy in the middle is Larry, and the other guy on the other side is Michael. We'll talk to him in just a moment. It's great to have you here with us once again. You know, Headlines and Headaches, I kind of always go through some headlines before I introduce our guest and find out who exactly he is, and for those of you that don't know him, what he's all about. But let me first start here as we kick it off quickly about some of the headlines we've seen over the last week. And I'm just going to throw the headlines out. And then maybe if we get to them as we talk going on, we'll talk a little bit about them. And of course, you know, one of the big things happening in the state of Minnesota, on Saturday, January 24th, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol shot and killed a 37-year-old man in Minneapolis following an altercation with federal agents. And of course, that's the second. Earlier this month, we had the shooting of Renee Good in a vehicle in the Minneapolis neighborhood. You know, we take a look at Tuesday, the latest on the Gaza peace deal. I mean, that's a big story in what's happening there. And Wednesday, we're kind of looking at the headline was, Larry and Michael, the measles outbreak, which is really interesting. In mid-January, South Carolina officials reported that measles is transmitting rapidly through their state, almost 800 confirmed cases, and the list goes on and in Utah and New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Well, then on Thursday, we hear about some shakeups in Minnesota immigration enforcement. Of course, the administration announced that the border czar, Tom Homan, would be coming to Minnesota to oversee the immigration enforcement efforts, and the Border Control Commander, Gregory Bavino, was sent back to do his thing elsewhere. Friday, this one just amazes me. Rapper and cultural icon Kanye West, known as Ye, took out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal apologizing for his past anti-Semitic remarks and blaming some of his actions on manic bipolar episodes. And then on Friday, of course, we all know journalist Don Lemon was arrested and this is a real interesting one for me. And Michael, I'm really looking on your take on this. Reportedly on charges of conspiracy to deprive others of their civil rights related to anti-immigration protests that disrupted a church service on January 18th in Minnesota. So those are some of the headlines that grabbed my attention. I want to take a moment here and ask our guest today, who I've known since 2000, and gosh, it's been 15, 16 years, Michael. Known him since back then. Michael, I know you're the type of guy that does not want to give out your resume and all the things that you do. But I think it's important that people know that are with us here on this podcast who don't know you. You give them a little background, if you could, a paragraph or two of where you've been, what you've done.
Absolutely. It's great to be on with you both. Senator Perry, it's always good to be back with you in any capacity. Yeah, my name is Michael Brodkorb. I'm the former deputy chair of the Republican Party of Minnesota. I've worked in a variety of capacity with Republican campaigns, and over the most of my adult life, worked for, as I said, the state party and a bunch of campaigns in Minnesota. Worked on Congresswoman Bachmann's first campaign, Eric Paulson's first campaign. Worked at the legislature for a number of years. I was a national delegate in 2008 to the national convention. But over the last few years, I've been more of what would kind of be considered a never Trumper. And so my political ideology today is I consider myself somewhat of a homeless Republican. I'm the state chair of an organization called Our Republican Legacy, which is focusing on where the party will be post Donald Trump and what values it stands for right now, and trying to build that kind of common sense consensus back inside the party. But I have voted for Democrats, I have voted for Republicans, and I am generally would say that I'm someone who is principle over party. and country over party, and that's how I would describe myself. But mostly kind of politically homeless.
All right. Well, that's a good explanation, I guess. Um, Larry, do you have a question you want to start this out
I
with for
guess.
Michael?
Well, I'll tell you what, you did a great write up here on your recent blog, Michael, about the 10 questions that Republican candidates in Minnesota should answer about a Trump endorsement. And we've obviously got a wide open field right now in Minnesota for the governor's race. What prompted you to kind of put that out there and to ask that question of the candidates, and what are you looking for from a candidate, and how do we win in this next election cycle?
Well, thanks for the question. Republicans haven't won statewide since 2006. I was with the Republican Party when Republicans won the governor's race in Minnesota. That was Governor Tim Pawlenty, my neighbor, here in Eagan. And it's been a long dry spell. And the challenges that I see, particularly related to Trump, is, and again, as someone who didn't support, has never voted for him, but wants the Republican Party to succeed and wants there to be a vibrant two-party system. I'm curious, as we have a crop of candidates running for governor and for the open U.S. Senate race we're going to have in Minnesota. I see a number of candidates going out there and continuing to seek and want the endorsement of President Trump. Minnesota has never voted for Donald Trump, contrary to his claims. He lost in 16, 20, and 24. And I've always tried to understand why Republicans in this state, when Trump is his polling is so low, and there's a difference between supporting him personally and supporting his policies. I believe that a number of his policies are popular, but for that the kind of cake is kind of baked for him. And so was curious from an electoral strategy as to why candidates would be working so hard to seek the endorsement of someone whose approval rating is pretty much in the toilet. And so that was kind of my mindset. And I wanted to get a little deeper down into, was it policy, was it personal, and what role would they want Trump to have in their campaign, and how ultimately is the support and endorsement of the president, again, separate from the policies, is beneficial to a Republican winning statewide. And so I wanted to throw out those questions, and if as I noted in the post, if I run across the candidates, I might ask them, but I'm also encouraging the public and others to kind of look at those questions and give some feedback, and maybe some of them will think they're relevant, others might not. But that was the context and the backstory there, Larry.
Excellent.
So, Michael, let me ask you this. If somebody is interested in seeing your op-ed on that, how would they get to it? Where would they go to find that?
Well, I'm linking they can go to michaelbrodkorb.com. I'm throwing it out on all of my social media platforms. People can follow me on Twitter and X now called, which is really kind of awkward. It used to, everyone knew what it was, and now you just say X. But across all social media platforms that you can find it on. I'm not big on Pinterest, so if you're looking for it on Pinterest, it probably won't be there. But all the other platforms, it will be. And that's where they can find it. But michaelbrodkorb.com is the main place where all of the good, the bad, and the ugly about me is found.
All right, that sounds good. So let's move on a little bit here. Another interesting writing that you had. Tell me about. Let me just see if I can find it was about cowardice. It was about a back and forth that you had with Representative Hudson. I have got to know more about this. And folks, seriously, you need to find Michael Brodkorb on social media because this is the Michael I know. And your response is, to me, absolutely spot on. So tell us, give enough to get people so interested they're going to go to Michael Brodkorb and find you. Representative Hudson, what happened?
So a couple weeks ago, there was a protest in Minnesota. Now, let me just be more specific. There's been a lot of that going on. But there was a event that was going to be happening in Minneapolis where someone from the very, very far right was going to be coming in and having a very kind of ugly kind of protest meant to, I think, inflame, incite from the right. And there was a Republican candidate for governor, Raul Estrada, who was promoting this type of event, and he was advertising it as a Kevlar up event. And for your listeners who don't maybe understand that context, he's in essence saying, wear your body armor, let's go to this event. And he also was talking about how people need to be willing to kind of lay their lives down for the fight that was happening here. All of the language that would be make it a very, very incendiary event, aside from the message, which was absolutely racist and just horrible on that regard. And I had gotten a tip from some law enforcement sources on the Republican side that said, hey, can you maybe post about this and talk to some party people and see if they could tone it down? Yeah, great. So I did. And a few days before the event, Representative Hudson went out with a post on X where he was trying to claim that this event was not in any way real and it was an AstroTurf event by leftists. And so the argument for your listeners about what an AstroTurf is you in essence fake that this is going on to try to incite something. It's an AstroTurf. It's not really real. And so you're just trying to kind of fake that this event is going on and showing support. And I replied to him and said, hey, Raul Estrada is a real person. He's running for governor. He's been on stage with Republican candidates for governor. Representative Hudson called me on the phone and was surprised that, and he was trying to play catch up a little bit. Representative Hudson, who I've had a complicated relationship with, I would say, is someone who likes to shoot first and then kind of ask questions later on social media. He is rather than ready, aim, fire, he fires first and then deals with the follow-up afterwards. And we had this conversation and I said, look, he's a real person. I said, if you want to be dismissive of this event, that's fine. But the best way you could be helpful is by calling Raul and telling other Republicans not to go, rather than pretending that this isn't a real event and a real problem. Our conversation then led into a discussion on ICE enforcement in the Twin Cities and the policies and the politics of it. My concern had been is that, and look, just again, in the interest of transparency for your listeners, I did not vote for Trump. I've never voted for Trump. But a part of Trump's campaign in 2024 was dealing with immigration and figuring out how to address an immigration problem that both parties have contributed to. One of my favorite statistics to discuss how long immigration has been going on is to note that Ronald Reagan, who was last president left in 89, in January of 89, he was the last president to sign comprehensive immigration reform in this country. That was a very, very long time ago. And so it's been an ongoing issue that both political parties have had to deal with. But in my conversation with Representative Hudson, I expressed concern about how the implementation of Trump's immigration enforcement policy, particularly in Minnesota, was being handled in such a ham-fisted, problematic way that when ICE left and kind of the waters receded, Republicans would be penalized for how it was being done. And as someone who wants to see Republicans succeed independent of Trump, my question was to Representative Hudson, is how this is being handled in such a bad way. My concern was that in the November elections, Republicans would get wasted and it would be like an extinction level event. I used that term with him, an extinction level event, which is like a comet hitting the earth and like killing all the dinosaurs. That's kind of like what it was going to be for Republicans. He agreed with me and said that how it was being implemented was problematic and Trump was being punitive towards the state. Let me say that one of the dynamics, and Senator Perry, you can maybe remember me discussing this, and Larry, we've met before, and I've talked about this, the politics of personalities. I believe that President Trump and Governor Walz not only disagree on policy, but they really dislike each other. Mm-hmm. And the byproduct of that is when there's that personal animosity, the state suffers. I think that President Trump is doing things in a punitive way on immigration in this state. And I think the governor, in some instances, is acting emotionally and not strategically, and that is preventing there from being better cooperation. But ultimately, the president has more resources, more tools, and he can out Trump, in essence, what the state does. A little play on words there. And so, what I was explaining to, when I was inquiring of Representative Hudson is, when this is all said and done, how does Republicans succeed? And he agreed with me. He said that he said that Trump was being punitive. He agreed. He said that Trump was, in fact, using Minnesota like a whipping boy, was his direct quote. And he had spoken with other people. And where I'd left the conversation with him I let him know I was gonna start messaging on concerns that I had of how this was being done and how it was gonna hurt Republicans. And he agreed with that. And we also talked about, how I was complimentary of House Republicans and the work they were doing on the fraud committee, a number of things. I thought it was a very positive conversation. Well, Representative Hudson viewed it differently or took advantage, I think, of that conversation. And he went out with a social media post and then did a video where he was trying to claim that even though privately he was telling me that there was concerns he had with the policy and the politics, that publicly his stance was, well, there's some things that are more important than elections. And he went out there with this crazy video talking about how he was, basically ready to be judged. It came across like something that a Branch Davidian or David Koresh would do, and kind of describing his kind of religious kind of feelings about how strong he was in what he was saying, which is exactly what was not represented on the phone call. And so the point of my post was, I called him on the phone, and it was not a pleasant conversation. I was very, very angry. I was angry because it was very dishonest. And I want to just be clear with your listeners and with you both. I understand, and Larry and Senator Perry, you may understand this in your own work experiences. But I can speak to Senator Perry for sure, is sometimes in order to solve a problem, a policy disagreement, there needs to be private diplomacy, little shuttle diplomacy. What can we get done? Have these kind of, backroom kind of discussions, and then what's dealt with publicly. I understand in this type of situation that people have very strong views, and because of the nature of the issue, some people might feel more comfortable speaking out than others. Others might try to work behind the scenes to address it and deal with it if they have concerns. I completely understand that. But if an elected official is going to speak out, particularly after having conversations with me, and then literally take what I said as a launching point to try to have a public disagreement with me, when you got on the phone and you agree with me, I'm going to throw the foul flag on that. And I did. And so I think it was a pushback on, I want to balance my remarks in saying that I understand it's not easy for people to speak up at all times. But if you're going to choose to speak up, at least be honest about what you said and what you believe, and not take the political calculation, because I just think that as someone who is sitting here in Minnesota who wants there to be a vibrant two-party system, Republicans are going to be extinguished in this election cycle if we don't start thinking about how our approach is. And again, just to close this out, I want to separate policy and politics and that intersection of them both. Again, President Trump ran on this was going to be a policy that he was going to do. I said back then, and I remain convinced now, that it was an unrealistic expectation that we would deport as many people as the president has claimed he wanted to do, that we weren't set up that way. And I think that's coming true. And so that was my take on it. And happy to answer any more questions, but that was kind of a long preamble of what happened. I hope I didn't exhaust you too much.
No.
No,
Larry,
no,
you
it's
got any comment?
No, it's always fun to hear both sides of things, and as we know, what we sometimes say in private to one another. You're right. You got to have that power of conviction to say it publicly as well, and follow through with it. And I think that's what's great about our party is that you can have three very conservative gentlemen that all have three very widely varying opinions on the political structure and makeup. But getting to the governor's race there, Michael, I want to get your input. We've got a pretty wide open array of things. I mean, we've got Lisa DeMuth, who obviously has some of the experience there. We've got Mike Lindell, who's got some of the backing and I guess the blessing so far of the president. You've got guys like Kendall Qualls that are getting out there. I was at an event just a couple of days before Chris Maddle dropped out, and I got to tell you that I thought he had some very reasonable policy positions, and again was giving a little pushback to the president, which I hadn't seen any other candidates do up until that point. Where do you think it's going to fall out? Who's your odds-on favorite at this point?
There are a lot of candidates running, and I think first of all, let me say I'm not working with or supporting not working with any candidate directly or indirectly. I just to kind of give my feel on the kind of the landscape. I think there's far too many candidates in this race. I think that's a distraction from the party process. Um, I would say that if I were a betting person, I think Speaker Dameth and her running mate Ryan Wilson, I think probably represent the best kind of complete ticket to Republican delegates. I don't believe that any other campaign has a running mate, and I'm someone who likes to see that kind of complete ticket out there so Minnesotans can kick the tires. Obviously, Kendall Qualls, who was almost endorsed in 2022, is a strong contender. I worry about Mike Lindell because I think a race against Mike Lindell and the presumptive Democratic nominee, who is Senator Klobuchar, would be like Tyson fighting an infant. I mean, it just would not be good, um, and it would really exacerbate the election. I think, and that's kind of where I see it right now. I think I can see Kendall. I can see, if I were to rank them, obviously I think Dameth and Wilson are going out there and doing all the right things and presenting the complete package.
Mhm.
Kendall is known amongst the activists, but I worry about that wild card, Larry, that Mike Lindell wild card, because there's so much material on him, and it will be such a polarizing race. And then you add in the dynamics of what's been going on the last few weeks, and it's a dangerous recipe. So my hope is that the activists will make good decisions, but we have 20 plus years of them making bad decisions, and
Yeah.
so we'll see. But that's kind of the lay of the land that I see it right now.
Yeah, I feel like Mike and Michael,
Michael,
I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry if you want to chime in on this,
go
though. I
ahead.
felt like we might
Go
have
ahead.
had that the conservative right might have had the moral high ground just before the ICE actions here. Like we were riding that fraud information, and I think whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, the average working guy understands fraud right at its core, that hey, something's being used the way it shouldn't have been used and I got ripped off. I felt that was a platform that we really could have attacked here, and then all of a sudden we have this blow up with ICE, and now it feels like it might have set us back or even knocked us out of the race completely.
I would absolutely agree with you. My old man who passed away a few years ago, Senator Perry, had the opportunity to meet him more than once. He was a forensic accountant. He was a CPA. And I will tell you that I want to make sure I'm very clear about this. One of the things that I've really liked about the House Republicans is their focus on fraud. That doesn't mean I'm pro fraud, okay? But it was a really good issue. It went to, I think, safe areas where Republicans, I think, are good at government overreach, transparency, the size and scope of government, Larry, the bureaucracy of it. Those are bread and butter issues. And I had heard from a number of Democrats who were very concerned about the lack of action by the Walz administration on this. And in the interest of disclosure, I was a Republican for Harrison Walz. I supported Walz in 2022. But I had raised concerns about fraud because one of the things, and you guys would know this as in your lives, is there has been no one at the state level, maybe one employee that I can think of, who's been held accountable lost their job because of what's going on. The bulk of the work that's been done to enforce fraud matters or to deal with it has been the U.S. Attorney's Office. And that's because of the bad actors inside state government. I don't think that state government had turned the ship fast enough to be responsive and address it. And that was
Hmm.
going to be a very, very important issue. But let's talk for a second about how ICE impacted that. Not only did the ICE operations consume the media attention about it, gentlemen, but concerns about the government's policy led to a number of people inside the U.S. Attorney's Office to quit. And I have said on my podcast and in other writings that if there was one person who I thought had the best political credentials in the state or was respected on both sides was Joe Thompson, Assistant United States Attorney. And he left because of how immigration policy was being implemented in this state. And that's a huge loss for Republicans. And it's a huge loss, let me just say, aside from party labels. It's a huge loss for all Minnesotans because I don't think, aside from people who are committing fraud, anyone is pro-fraud. And so that was a good issue for Republicans to deal with. So now what Republicans are dealing with is ICE immigration in the news, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has been gutted, and people have left because of concerns. So the issue that I had said at the end of the year was going to be a drip, drip, drip for Republicans, spigot's been turned off. And now we're dealing with other issues.
Completely.
All right, so let me just go back on a couple of things here. I recall when I was in, the guy that I really admired, and I know you know who he is, and that's the legislative auditor, Jim Nobles. He came out with some really interesting comments about fraud, and I'm not sure if you happen to grab hold of that, Michael. Your thoughts?
I did. Yeah, you're right, Senator Perry. Jim Nobles was the legislative auditor for a number of years. And one of the things that we don't have, aside from Minnesota having this kind of good government reputation, we don't have like an Office of Inspector General or like an Elliot Ness type. If you think about
Right.
everyone kind of remembers Elliot Ness, that kind of worked for the Treasury Department and stuff. Who went after Al Capone. So Jim Nobles was the kind of best example of a bureaucratic staff level Office of Inspector General who could root out fraud. And he did audits and a number of things. He had a number of concerns about the level of fraud and what the governor's office was doing in response to it. And over the years, and he's no longer there, but he did a good job, I think, of framing up with institutional credibility. One of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I think happens more is as long we all have all of these tools to talk with each other. I mean, we're communicating in a way in which right now in this podcast, 15 years ago, Senator, I would have been blown away that we could do this. We're recording a podcast from all separate locations. But here we are connecting. We have all of these ways in which to communicate with each other, but I think we're talking less to each other on one-on-one kind of these kind of conversations. And I think that Jim Nobles and Joe Thompson had credibility that kind of transcended
Yeah.
party lines. And so when someone like Joe Thompson or Jim Nobles was critical of fraud, I think it had ability to break through. And he was very critical of how the lack of response by the administration in dealing with fraud. And it goes back to Larry's question and his comment that fraud was dominating the news, rightfully so, for
Yeah.
all the wrong reasons, because it was bad. And this is what I think. I don't by any stretch of the imagination believe that all of this, I don't think someone in the White House went down and said, okay, we got to take the attention away from fraud. Or I think, but the truth of the matter is what's going on right now with ICE in this state, big, dramatic, problematic. There is a byproduct, and I'm not saying that's planned. I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anyone, the loss of life or the trauma that anyone has felt, but that takes away the attention from an issue that was very good for Republicans to be talking about.
Let's talk about Walls and Ellison. They've been subpoenaed to testify I think it's March 4th, on the fraud scandal. What's your take on that, Michael? What do you think is going to happen there? Outside, let me say, outside
I think
of the
it's
key person being Representative Tom Emmer going after him.
I think that there's been it's going to be political theater. I think people are going to take from it what they want. It's going to be a bit of political theater. I think it is an attempt by Republicans, rightfully so, to exercise their oversight. And I will say to you that the one person outside of Joe Thompson and Jim Nobles that I think has done a really good job of messaging on fraud has been Congressman Brad Finstead. He's done a great job of talking about it. And so I think there's going to be that hearing coming up, and Ellison and the governor are going to be out there. I think it's going to be political theater. And not to say that that's bad, because I'm certainly as someone who's bought a front row ticket to political theater, and it's a part of politics. But what I worry about is that we're not getting to the root of what it was. And I think there's a lot of people that are just like, okay, another congressional hearing, that's great. It's going to bring attention to it. That's the oversight role. But how is it actually going to get solved? And the one thing that concerns me about fraud is the governor. There's differences in what legislative authority is versus the governor. The governor is the chief executive. A legislator is one of 201 in Minnesota. And so there's just different power. And I think what I would like to see, independent of the political theater, is Republicans offering concrete solutions as to how they're going to address this. Because one of the advantages of being the governor is you can issue an executive order, you can bypass the legislative mess that exists. And I think it's going to be interesting. The last time that Governor Walz was out in D.C., I mean, it was just a slugfest. Back and forth. And I don't know that much got accomplished. But so my hope this time, I should say, is that there's testimony and that I think what Republicans need to do is to come out of that with some solutions. The other thing I would say is Republicans have to remember that Walz is not running for reelection anymore. And so every time they focus on him as a shiny object just to kick around, that is detracting from messaging that could be going on in the governor's race. Because who gets to sit out that fight is Senator Klobuchar, who is the
Yeah.
presumptive nominee for governor on the Democratic side.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's the thing that I've been telling anyone that'll listen is that we can't just attack Walls or make him like you said, the whipping post. I think that Republicans have to come to the table with the ideas and the solutions. Right, we have to come out and say, "Hey, this is the plan to fix this. This is how we're going to proceed. These are our policies, and this is why it matters." And really attack that because I think we've got a solid foundation to build on. But getting that message out to people in an extremely liberal state, it's tough to find those motivating factors to get those to the left to switch over.
One other point on fraud that I would make is that the size and scope of it is so big that I'm wondering if it's almost too big for people to wrap their heads around. um, because it's such a big number and the size and scope of it. I said this on my podcast and on social media that I think Republicans will be better off focusing and just going back to driving home the most egregious examples, which there is a lot of it. It seems like they're still in the collection phase. And there's so much that they've collected. I'm wondering if people just be like, oh, it's another fraud story, rather than driving home the few examples that we have. And that's, I think, going to be I'm interested to see, like, post-election exit polls, to what degree fraud had a role in the election
Mhm.
and what actually got through to people.
Mhm.
So, Michael, let me ask you this. I know in the past we've talked about uh, name recognition with the fact that Senator Klobuchar has jumped into the race against the Republican candidates out there, how important do you see it in today's world, that name recognition to be?
Very important. I mean, I think um, name ID is incredibly important. I mean, most people, and I please push back if anything I say, always push back, but push back if you think I'm wrong. I don't think most voters pay attention as much as we think they do. And so a lot of people on election day will go into the polls and they will cast a ballot for the name that they know and the name that they recognize and that feeling that they have. That's part of the reason why I think Trump, the cake is baked on Trump, is because his name has been on the ballot and he's consistently lost. Klobuchar is the reverse of that. In the interest of full transparency, I worked on Mark Kennedy's race for Congress in 06 against Senator Klobuchar. We raised more money. We got our tails kicked in by Senator Klobuchar. She is an incredibly strong campaigner. She is an incredibly strong in constituent service, the work that she does. She has got the bake is caked for her, but in a good way. And the people know her. And so name ID running against her, I mean, respectfully, and I mean this in the most respectful way, she is the equivalent of an 800-pound gorilla in politics. I mean, she's just a juggernaut. And obviously, the only electoral defeat that she's had is when she ran for president. But she is, I mean, just respectfully, with all the deference that's needed, an 800-pound gorilla. And so the Republican candidate needs to run a tighter, smarter, better operation. But remember something, what I just said. In 06, we raised more money in Klobuchar. And 06 was a brutal year for Republicans. Mark Kennedy was a sitting congressman, and Klobuchar mopped the floor with us. And she has the brand ID of someone like a Humphrey and a Mondale that and that kind of brand credibility that is just very strong in the state. So name ID, defining who you are as a candidate, having good name ID, and running a good operation. That's going to be your best bet against a candidate like Klobuchar.
And of course, that might be
I
something
think you're
we
muted,
could
Sid.
attribute to her father, who for years wrote for the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. So name recognition there. But let me throw this out, Michael. Klobuchar, DeMuth. What happens in the election?
I think that Damuth represents, I think, again, and look, people think I'm a rhino if on a good day. So I'm just offering my analysis. I'm not trying. I've met Damuth a couple times. She's been on my podcast. I have no a connection to the campaign. So, but I'm as with you, Senator, and with Larry, who I know, I always want to give you my best and honest take. But I think that Damuth Wilson represents the strongest ticket against Klobuchar for a variety of reasons, and some of which are superficial, but also policy based. First of all, and let me just again, Speaker Namath, elected on a write-in campaign. That's significant. Local experience at the local level, then becoming and getting the Republicans through, and leading the Republicans, and then becoming Speaker. That's not a small accomplishment. And then the balance of Wilson. Wilson is, I think he's from the Plymouth Maple Grove area. So there's geographic balance on the ticket. She's from up by St. Cloud Sartell area, I think. And so there's outstate metro balance, gender balance. She's female. Wilson's a male. There's that type of balance. She African American. Wilson white guy. There's if you're just kind of being superficial and respectful, obviously,
Right.
there's contrast there. And I will also say to you that I think Klobuchar running against, I think the dynamics of having a Speaker of the House in Minnesota with that pedigree, with that strength, going up against, a member of the United States Senate. Klobuchar is very strong. Not only is she strong from a candidate perspective, mentally, she is strong. She is quick on her feet. She is as sharp of a candidate that I think that the Democrats have on their side. And so I would say to you that if I was playing the game and moving the chess pieces around, that the opportunity that Republicans best have would be with Dameth versus Klobuchar.
All right. Jason Sneed. Minnesota's vouching disaster proves America needs SAFE Act. Michael, what's your thoughts?
Republicans believe, and again love to give your feedback on what I'm about to say, but they're including the president. The president of the United States believes that he won Minnesota in 16, 20, and 24. I have my doubts. Republicans are still, many of them, and that's one of the concerns I have with Mike Lindell running as the candidate, still trying to litigate the 2020 election. And it's 2006. And my worry that election issues like this, election integrity issues, just consume and distract Republicans. I don't know that on any Minnesota poll, election integrity is going to poll high. I do believe, and I will say, that polling continues to reflect that photo ID is important, and there are some concerns about vouching by some. I think that Republicans have the legislature. They control the Minnesota House of Representatives. They have the speakership. If there were concerns, election results to the level at which people are discussing, I think there'd be an opportunity for Republicans to address those more. But I worry that it becomes chasing down a rabbit hole and a distraction that doesn't play itself out well in the election. Again, just to be clear, the polling is overwhelming the people that support the use of photo ID at an election and help secure them. I have been supportive of it. I think it would be a common sense fix. I know there's arguments on both sides, but at some point, I think it's going to have its day. But right now, it doesn't.
Interesting. So I have so many questions rolling around. How about you, Larry? I just
Well,
want to keep this guy on forever and ever.
well, yeah, no, I appreciate the conversation because you've been steeped in this world for a long time and you're very well versed at it, Michael. So it's an interesting conversation to have. I do think that. Again, I agree with you that the voting integrity could be a bit of a distraction. But I think that if you give the voting public something like the SAVE Act and say, hey, yeah, we're going to put the photo IDs out there. Now at some point you have to say, okay, well, yeah, we've got this. Now you need to you need to abide by the results. I've worked at the county level here with some of these people, and they're citizens just like you and I, and there's nobody there that I've seen willfully trying to manipulate results or anything. I can't speak to other areas of the country because we know that there's definitely people in high positions, pushing against, something that doesn't align with their beliefs. But is it to the degree to where it could snudge the election on a national election? I don't believe that. But I think that helping the integrity of the system in all aspects just emboldens people's faith in it again.
I would agree with you. My problem with, and I would agree with your, my problem with is when you have the president going out there saying he's won, and he goes out there and say it's because of fraud and all this stuff. I think that hinders the discussion because I think photo ID makes sense. It's not because I think there is rampant fraud that could overturn an election. It's because I think it makes sense. I think it would be it's kind of the thing. I don't know if you guys ever saw Tommy Boy, but when the
Yes.
guy's talking about, in Tommy Boy, like the guarantee's not in the box. I just want the guarantee on the box. And this is a situation where if I think it would, and I understand the arguments on both sides, but the polls show that most Americans overwhelmingly support photo ID. And if doing something like just putting the guarantee on the box would help have voters have more confidence in going to the polls, I would like that. Because as I have always been, independent of when I became hyper partisan when I was more in my life, and I think Senator Perry can attest to, have always wanted people to vote and to have belief in the electoral system and the electoral process.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to throw this out. The political rhetoric
Boy,
that comes from both sides of the aisle. What would have happened over the last few weeks in Minneapolis had there not been the political rhetoric from the Trump administration to the Walz administration when they're talking to the constituents? Michael, I truly believe that these two shootings could have been avoided. When I start seeing other states in this country having immigration control and deportations, not having any kind of riots or protest, for some reason my mind keeps going back to both sides attributed to the loss of lives because of their volatile political rhetoric.
I agree. I agree with you. And I think, Larry, we've met before, and Senator Perry, you know me. I'm someone who, and I've always adopted this. I feel very fortunate for my age because I remember what it was. I remember talking and living in a time before there was social media. So I very early adopted the rule. I was never going to write something on social media that I wouldn't say to someone's face. And so what most people don't adopt that rule, and that's fine. But I'm a passionate advocate of the first of all the amendments, but certainly the First and Second Amendment. And I've posted on this discussion, and which is this is early on in this kind of standoff that we're having. I encouraged our elected leaders to log off social media and pick up the phone and start talking to people, because one of the things that happens is our siloed information, our channels become so they're just one-sided, and we're just speaking to the masses, and we're speaking to we're speaking to our side, not to the masses, and the amped up rhetoric. I disagree with many of the things that Kristi Noem and President Trump and JD Vance have said. Simultaneously, I'm getting tired of the governor bringing up the Civil War and amping things up that way. Talking about the Civil War is not a way to tone down the rhetoric. And having statewide press events where you're telling people to go out into the streets and to document, again, we are just at a point in our society where I'm an advocate of the First Amendment. I'm an advocate of the Second Amendment. But you have to be careful, and people have to exhibit some common sense. And I think some protests have gone from protests to interfering with law enforcement investigations, interfering with federal functions, federal immigration rules they have. On the flip side, I think there has been a roughness that has occurred by agents where they're not using the best tactics and strategies to de-escalate. I believe, as I will long believe, that social media is going to be one of those things that people are going to realize it's like cigarettes and cancer, that we just wish we could approach it differently. And there's not many situations where I say, oh, great, we have a social media post. That's going to really help us get this thing tampered down. And it just lathers people up. But again, Senator and to Larry, I think part of the reason that this thing spun out of control is because President Trump doesn't like Tim Walz and Governor Walz does not like President Trump. And that conflict, that personal conflict, made this situation get worse. And who suffers from that is average Minnesotans, people who go out in the streets. I applaud anyone exercising their First Amendment rights. I'm generally an absolutist on the First Amendment, but your First Amendment right doesn't give you a right to interfere with the law enforcement work. It doesn't get you. It doesn't allow you to complicate and compromise federal agents when they're there. I have a lot of concerns, and I don't think anyone is. I don't think. I think both sides contributed to what's occurred in Minnesota. And the rhetoric of this on both sides, and I get it, and this is the other thing that frustrates me is when people hear both sides, they immediately want to keep a tally sheet like, oh, this one did one more than the other side. I'm just saying both
Yeah.
sides.
Yeah.
I'm just saying both sides. It's like I'm driving a car and my kids are in the back seat arguing. I'm just saying, just stop. I don't care who started it. Just stop and do better. And I think what we need right now with these types of problems is people willing to come in and be like, yeah, I'm not worried about a social media post. I'm not trying to create policy for content so it can engage listeners. I just want our state and our country to function better.
Hmm. Well stated.
When you read through that and you see that after 63 years, they're updating what has been a standard for the American Legion since 1919. It has a lot to be said. And I say, folks, if you get a chance, it's the 21st century definition of Americanism by National Commander of the American Legion, Dan Wiley. So, Michael, we covered a lot here. And I truly, truly love you to death for being on our show. But I want to take it one more step. I want you to tell us about how you got the headline of Brodkorb and Becky, or is it Becky and Brodkorb? I want you to tell us about your podcast because people listening to us probably have not heard. I think it's I think you've had some fantastic guests. I think what you two cover. So tell us about the two personalities and how this came about.
Well, in 2020, 2022, and then in 2022, Becky and I started a podcast in 2022 about just going over politics and looking at things. And Becky shares my podcast co-host. It's called The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Becky has had a long, distinguished career in Republican circles. She worked at the state party, executive director. She was a spokesperson for and communications director for Congressman Tom Emmer, now the House Majority Whip. Becky and I have, but one of the reasons why when some people approached me about doing a podcast, why I wanted it to work with Becky is because she's pushed back on me. She has called balls and strikes to me. She has never been afraid to say, "Hey, Brodkorb, you're full of it." And so the dynamic that we have is we approach things from the center right, but what we try to do is we try to carve out a space where we can disagree with people without being disagreeable. We cultivate our guests and everyone that we have on. And Senator and Larry, I would love to have you guys on at some point. We try to bring people on that elevate the discussion. We try to really, again, elevate the discussion. And we've had Democrats, Republicans, presidential candidates, we've had journalists, average Joe citizens. The purpose of the show is to just break down issues, kind of get in the weeds, but simultaneously talk to each other. And what that means is that doesn't mean we rein in our guests. That doesn't mean that we don't get angry or frustrated, but we talk in a way in which it's educational and it's civic minded. What we're trying to do is just raise everybody's civic IQ. And that's why we do it. And I absolutely have fallen in love with the whole podcast medium. It was a good thing for me to learn how to do. I think it's a great way in which to responsibly create content and get out there and really get a message to where people are. Podcasting, I think, is going to continue to grow. It's going to be easier to do it. And the technical advancements that I've seen just since when I started are just amazing. And so I would encourage people to listen to it, but also get involved in podcasting. I
Mm-hmm.
think it is really this is the current kind of town square for people.
Yeah. No,
Wow.
absolutely. I would agree
Yeah.
with you that it lends itself to more dynamic discussion than just the snippets and sound bites that you get, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or Insta or whatever platform that folks are using, because, you can turn those things into an echo chamber, basically. You can throw out little snippets and generalizations, but to sit and have dialogue in an open conversation, the podcast, I think, is the true medium that can take advantage of this new social media world, if you will.
And I also
Absolutely.
think that doing a podcast gives that buffer between the folks that gives them a little bit more security, I think, to say what they really want to say without having somebody shove it down their throat. If you're actually having an open conversation, of which we want to do here on Headlines and Headaches, let's just talk about the headlines. What are the potential headaches? And let's have an open conversation amongst adults and folks that are concerned.
I would agree. And the one thing I would say is that we, what I honestly enjoy about having a podcast is nearly every episode, I have someone on who I disagree with some things on. And what I've noticed is my ability to, here's the one couple of really good things about having a podcast. I find myself listening more because of the amount of time I spend doing the podcast. I have to listen and have conversations. And so I find myself in my personal life listening more because when you're doing a podcast, one side gets to talk, you have to listen, and you respond. So there's that good thing. I also love to have people on, and nearly every week I have somebody on who disagrees with me. And I think it's important that we continue as we have debates and discussions, kind of sometimes meet some resistance in that it meets some intellectual resistance
Mhm.
and people pushing back. And I know that my political philosophy and my outlook on life has changed in many ways because of the podcast, because I think I have much more balanced perspectives on events and situations while still holding my true core values.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Michael, we're going to want you to visit us once again down the road. Are you up for that?
Anytime, and I would look forward to having you both on my podcast and do a little cross promotion.
All right.
Absolutely. Anytime
Well,
you want
that's
us.
it. That's it. Headlines and headaches with Mike and Larry. And Michael, thank you very much. I know you're busy and everything, and it's just an honor to have you on our show as we're trying to kick this off and move forward with it. And thank you much, and be well, as you always say to everyone that you talk to. And we'll join the folks again in our next episode.